So you could say this is the new normal, but it's going to become even more intense.
I mean, what's extraordinary is that by any sort of conventional metric of what it is like to live right now, it should be, and it should feel like, the best time to ever be alive. You know, we're living longer, we're living healthier, there are actually fewer wars than in recorded history, water's cleaner, there's less abject poverty, and so on and so on. And yet young people in particular, very large numbers of young people, seem completely gripped in a kind of a doom-laden neurosis about life. What is going on there? I mean, Jonathan Haidt wrote this fascinating book about the impact of cell phones, but it can't just be that.
No, I think the cell phones are particularly bad because they interfere with childhood play, and childhood play isn't replaceable. When children play, that's how they formulate their identities, and that's how they cement their social groups, and that's how they learn to integrate themselves with other people and to play nice together, which is something you obviously have to do as an adult. And screen time seriously interferes with that. And then, well, there's content as well. Pornography is a complete bloody catastrophe in 15 different dimensions. And then I would say as well, there's been a Malthusian, a neo-Malthusian campaign going on since the 1960s to basically demoralize young people based on this preposterous idea that essentially there are too many people on the planet, that human beings are a kind of cancer, that all masculine striving upward is part of the pathological patriarchy, which is a real lovely thing to teach young men who, and if they manage to escape, the criticism as well of their play styles when they're young, then their ambition comes under assault, and they're fed a never-ending diet of apocalyptic catastrophe that's human caused, and caused even worse by exactly the human ambition that actually in the main makes things better. So it's not surprising they're demoralized. And the same is true for young women. I mean, they're divorced completely, increasingly divorced from their traditional destiny, which is associated with monogamous marriage and the rearing of children. And I'm not saying, just for anybody foolish who might be listening, that that's all women are capable of, but it's also something I hold in extremely high esteem. Piers, we have a situation now in the West with regards to young women. So young men are demoralized. 50% of women 30 and under are now childless in the West. 50%. And half of them will never have a child. And 90% of them will regret it. By the time you're 30, you're already a geriatric mother. And if you're single and 30 and childless, you have a lot of problems to solve in a very short period of time. And then you also got to ask yourself, well, what's your life going to be like if you're partnerless and childless from your 30s going forward? And we know in keeping with that the segment of the population that's most politically alienated at the moment is, in fact, young women from the ages of 18 to 34. And that's also partly because they get almost all their information from TikTok. And TikTok is a rat hole of propaganda, funded by Iran, funded by China, funded by Russia, but Iran and China primarily. And so you're right in your first supposition, is that we've made immense strides forward, especially since the Berlin Wall fell and the idiot communist regimes around the world that were doing everything they could to destroy their own people's economy have collapsed, and people have turned, at least in the main, to something approximating free market and free exchange solutions. And so the world has 8 billion people on it, something like that, 7 to 8 billion. We'll peak at about 9. We've done a tremendous amount to eradicate absolute poverty, and there are lots of reasons to be positive, but that's all in the face of an anti-human campaign that's really been going on since the 1960s with the Club of Rome and Paul Ehrlich, the Stanford biologist, who's, I don't know if he's the worst person who's emerged in the last 60 years, but he's certainly a contender. Massive campaign of demoralization. And I see it everywhere when I tour around lecturing. Like young people dying for the lack of an encouraging word. It's really And in the face of all this possibility, it's really quite awful.
Yeah, it is. And, I was very struck by something that Elon Musk said to you when you interviewed him for your hugely successful podcast. Let's take a look.
I was essentially tricked into signing documents for one of my older boys, Xavier. This was before I had really any understanding of what was going on, and we had COVID going on, and so there was a lot of confusion. I was told, Xavier might commit suicide if he.
That was a lie right from the outset.
I lost my son essentially. They call it dead naming for a reason.
Yeah,
All right. So the reason it's called dead naming is because your son is dead. So my son Xavier is dead, killed by the woke mind virus.
I mean, I found it was a startling thing to watch that and to hear him say that. And we've watched that kind of human tragedy of his family play out in public because this boy that he had, this son, now identifies in a different way and is very hostile towards him and says so on social media and so on. But what did you feel when Elon Musk, right now, the richest, most successful, and in many ways, most entrepreneurial guy in the world, somebody who is really trying to save the world from itself in many ways through Tesla, through SpaceX, through Neuralink, all these extraordinary things. There he was, just gripped in his own human crisis with his own family because of a mindset which has wrestled his child away from him.
Well, that shows you how pervasive the problem is, especially with regards to our current misconceptions of what constitutes identity. And even someone like Elon Musk has a family that falls prey to it. And, you said at the beginning of this interview that I tend to say things that are, let's say, incendiary. So I might as well do that right now. I think that every single medical professional and psychological professional who has been, who's played a role in facilitating the trans butchery of minor children should be put in prison for the rest of their lives for crimes against humanity. It is the worst medical and certainly psychological scandal that I've ever seen in my entire life. And the only things that I've seen that rival it are the medical experiments that were conducted by the Nazis and the Japanese in the running up to World War II. It's absolutely 100% unforgivable. And that lie that he told Elon Musk, would you rather have a live trans child or a dead child? There's never been a single bit of evidence to suggest that has no grounding whatsoever in empirical fact. It's an absolute bloody lie. It's pathological beyond belief. We know in the United States, for example, that at least 8,000 young women have been subjected to double mastectomies, minors. And that's the documentation on the insured medical procedure side. So there's a lot more than that. And I also know that puberty blocking drugs are available outside the medical community in the black and gray market at a much higher rate than is occurring within the medical space. And that the fact of this trans epidemic, which is exactly what it is, it's a psychological epidemic, and the liars say those children are all now free to show their true identity, which is another complete bloody lie. All of that's it's so unacceptable. It was so sad to hear Musk walk through that. I mean, there's a world of grief behind that story, and there's plenty of stories like it. I can't believe as well, I mean, this is one of the things that I hold seriously against the Democrats in the United States, let's say, the Liberals in Canada and the Labour Party in the UK, is that if you people are behind this identity politics and you think that it's a good idea to free up young women in particular to find their true identities as men, there is something seriously sick about you. It's inexcusable. It's absolutely inexcusable. It is. There is no evidence whatsoever for any of those gender transformation identity claims, as the Cass report clearly indicated. So, the UK has walked back a little bit, but not the US and not Canada. Mm-hmm. And so it's really, Jesus, Pierce, the more you know about that surgery, the more it will it'll curdle your spine. It's experimental medicine conducted by butchering sadists at its absolute worst. What they do to people to transform them into, what would you say, malfunctioning pseudo members of the opposite sex it's far beyond brutal. And I would like to also point out clinically that there's been evidence for a very long time that sadists are overrepresented in the profession of surgery. And all you have to do is think for about 15 seconds before you could figure out why that might be. So yeah, it's really, man, as far as moral crimes go, sterilization and mutilation of children, involuntary, because they cannot consent to such medical procedures. And so that's a crime against humanity in accordance with UN definitions. And so I just think it's to call it reprehensible is to barely scrape the surface.
Yeah.
And I don't think it'll stop till there are the right length of prison sentences for the people who've been involved in it.
Yeah. The other thing that Elon Musk has been at the center of course, is the battle, as he puts it, for free speech. And you're seeing it coming under attack, probably like we've never seen free speech be attacked before. Is it because, Jordan, people don't understand what free speech actually is? Or is it because this woke mind virus that Musk talks about has turned people who, if you ask them, would say, oh, I'm a liberal, but it's actually turned them into a new breed of fascist?
Well, we can't again underestimate the impact of the new technologies. You know, we've invented a whole variety of means to network people together at a scale and a rate that's never been attempted before in human history. And we're playing with all these technologies that look trivial on the surface. You know, for example, on Twitter, for a long time, the character limit was 140 characters. Well, we have no idea what happens to the human race when you link hundreds of millions of people together and flood them with political information and only allow them to communicate in a 140 character burst. I mean, that's equivalent, Piers, that's equivalent to a radical biological mutation. Like, it's a major transformation, and it's only one of a series of such transformations that are continually occurring in the virtual space. And so one of the things we have to understand is that we can't contend with this because we don't understand the significance of the technologies. You know, I've been watching Zuckerberg and Musk try to deal with the issue of policing the net. And you can see both of them are whipping boys in a way. You know, Zuckerberg is a whipping boy for people on the right, and Musk is a whipping boy for people on the left. But they're both making a mistake. Both groups are making a mistake in attacking those two, in my estimation, even though they may have done things that weren't wise or well considered as they were experimenting their way forward. It's like nobody knows how to police the net. And the idea that you can link together hundreds of millions of people who can now communicate while bearing no responsibility whatsoever for the content of their utterances, the idea that we can do that without a policing mechanism is absurd.
Yeah.
We've never been able to do that. Now, what the policing method should be, now that's a complicated problem, right? It's just as complicated as the issue of free speech and its limits itself. And the truth of the matter is we don't know. You know, I talked to Lex Friedman on after a podcast I did with him recently about one of the things that I think is pathologizing discourse. You know, I believe that the 3 to 5% of the population who are clinical psychopaths, and that's about what it is, see, they'll weaponize political discourse, left-wing and right-wing, because they don't give a damn about politics. They'll weaponize political discourse to bring attention to themselves. And they can do that online with their anonymous accounts because they can't be held responsible. And so they can gain social reputation in a narcissistic and pathological way while dementing the entire field of discourse to everyone's downfall. Like, a friend of mine has been doing polling on main political issues for the last few months. He's working on a project designed to address the excesses of the victimizer narrative that underlies such phenomena, let's say, as anti-Semitism. And he showed quite clearly that Americans, and you could extrapolate to the rest of the West, Americans hold views that are 85% in common across a very broad range of contentious political issues. And yet we have the amplification of divisive political discourse that makes everyone believe that there's far more division than there is. And that's all weaponized by a cadre of psychopaths. And you might think, well, you're exaggerating that, Dr. Peterson. It's like, I'm not exaggerating that. The problem of manipulative parasitism is an ancient biological problem. There's evidence that sex itself evolved to solve the parasite problem. And really what we have online is the fact that the free social media communication networks are swarmed by parasites who are narcissistic and Machiavellian, and they're warping and twisting the system to bring themselves up into a public view they don't deserve by exaggerating the significance of the discrepancy between people. And like, I think of all the things that I can see happening, especially in the online world, there's plenty of dangers in the real world, but on the online world, the fact that the narcissistic psychopaths have the upper hand in the realm of free, so-called free discourse is, what would you say, first and foremost among them. One of the things I recommended, well, Friedman and I talked about this, is I think that on social media platforms, the anonymous people and the verified human beings should be put in separate bins. Like, I think the anonymous people should be allowed to have their say, but they should be categorized separately from the verified human beings, because otherwise they can't be held responsible for their utterances. Now, we know there's an immense psychological literature on this. We know that if you put people in situations where they're shielded from the repercussions of their actions, they're much more likely to misbehave. And that's really terrible in the case of people who are really prone to misbehave. Like, if you're driving in your car, that bug shell you protect yourself with, you're much more likely to curse at someone if they cut you off than you would be if you were walking and they could hear you.
Right.
Because a lot of what regulates our social behavior is immediate feedback that pertains to our reputation. That's all stripped away, especially in the case of the anonymous troll demons online. And it's really bad.
Jordan, let me ask you, is there a correlation between what you're talking about here and what is happening with these people who are now wanting to kill Donald Trump, for example? And in the case of the second shooter, is on record on his social media amplifying talking points that have been rammed home by Democrats, including Kamala Harris, Hillary Clinton, and others. Donald Trump is an existential threat to democracy. He was posting exactly the same phraseology and had whipped his mind into a place where presumably he felt the only answer to save America and democracy from inevitable extinction was to get rid of the person who would perpetrate that, and that's Trump. I mean, is there a correlation here?
Well, there's an old saying, Pierce, that's accurate psychologically, that when the working class, or when the aristocracy catches a cold, the working class dies of pneumonia. And so one of the ways of thinking about that more generally is that if things start to become unstable, let's say with regards to combative terminology at the pinnacle of the social hierarchy, that echoes down the rungs of the hierarchy to people who are already pretty damn unstable. And it doesn't take much to tilt them over the edge. You know, when this trans issue arose in Canada in 2016, when the government of Canada made it their business to compel the speech of people in relationship to gender identity and gender, what do they call it? The way you present yourself. I don't remember the terminology at the moment. I told the Canadian Senate that they were going to cause a psychological epidemic, because when you destabilize the center, you really upset the fringe. And so, well, we've seen two fringe. Now, we don't know everything that's going on in the background with regard to those assassination attempts, but as you turn up the temperature, it's the people at the bottom of the bloody hierarchy who boil. You do the same thing when you raise energy costs to save the planet. It's like you punish the people who are barely clinging to the edge of the world most dramatically. Like, they don't take much additional stress to knock them off. 1% increase in unemployment produces a 5% increase in psychiatric hospitalizations. You know, and so careless, well, and you know, the other thing too is that the social media communication platforms that we've invented, as I said already, they incentivize careless speech. You know, it's been hard for me, for example, to learn how to communicate properly on Twitter and X because it rewards impulsive behavior. And it's very difficult to remember. I'm sure it's difficult for Musk to remember that an ill thought through comment that might be fine in the confines of a private conversation can have a massively disproportionate effect given that it's published to, well, in Musk's case, you know, more than 100 million people. And we don't have the kind of wisdom with regards to the regulation of our speech and our emotions that enables us to act wisely when there's that short a gap between mouth and publication. So, you know, we're still in the early phases of determining how to regulate our behavior online. Now, have the Democrats been particularly egregious in that regard? Well, there's been 2 assassination attempts on Trump. And so you could draw whatever conclusion from that you think is meet. It's obviously a terrible thing. And the problem, too, is there's another problem, which is that copycat crimes are very, very, very common.
Yeah.
And it's partly because the pathological types, they keep an eye on each other. You know, for example, on the school shooter side, there's a school shooter subculture. Make no mistake about it. And the people who are fantasizing for the thousands of hours that are necessary to fantasize before you transform yourself into a school shooter, they're perfectly aware of their peers and those who they are competing with and the best way to gain maximal public attention. So, and that's also amplified, let's say, in its pathology by this interconnectedness. It's like one of the things we don't know, for example, Pierce, is we don't know, well, when you link everyone together, you know, we're trying to educate people at the moment en masse with this Peterson Academy that we launched. And it's a wonderful thing to be able to use the net because we can bring extremely high quality lecturers to the attention of an unlimited amount of people for very low cost. And so we're trying to facilitate the spread of the highest quality ideas. But, you know, at the same time, the social media networks and the internet itself facilitate the transmission of the lowest quality ideas. And which of those are going to win out in the long run is a very difficult question. You know, and that's the free speech question too. You know, the more libertarian types, and certainly Elon Musk, believe that if you just put the information in front of people, that the best ideas will win. And I think fundamentally that's true. But we have to understand that the free speech tradition that we've inherited in the West has been bound by a set of traditions and practices that have enabled it to function. You know, you could say, for example, that the free speech that characterizes the West emerged in the context of general group adherence to a set of well-established Judeo-Christian norms, and that it worked within that context, that implicit context. And as that underlying structure falls apart, then the problems with untrammeled speech mount, not least because the narcissistic psychopaths come rushing forward, and it's very, very difficult to regulate them. Now, you know, I am an advocate for free speech. I'm on Musk's side in this argument, but I also understand that the 3%, 5%, something like that, of truly bad actors, they're worse than you think. I guess I'd add one more thing to that. I have a suspicion as well that people on the left have less of an imagination for evil and are therefore more likely to be captured in their endeavors by the Machiavellian actors. And I believe that because the more liberal / progressive types are higher in trait agreeableness, which makes them value compassion, for example, in the way that they do. And the problem with compassion, apart from the fact that it can become devouring if it's overextended, like you shouldn't treat grown people, for example, as if they're infants because you demoralize them. The other problem is that you have a proclivity to presume that everyone who's misbehaving is a victim who needs sympathy. Now, it could even be that 80% of criminals are salvageable, maybe even 90%, but the 10% that aren't, boy, you better look out for them. And if you are incapable of imagining that there's a subset of people who are animated primarily by self-interest and malevolence, you know very little about the world.
But there's
1% of the criminals.
There's also
1% of the criminals commit 65% of the crimes.
But you hit on something when you spoke a little earlier, where you said that people. I mean, I've seen it happen, and I knew this would happen. That the explosion of conversation about mental health has led to two things. On a negative side. Well, three actually. One is that so many people now self-identify as mentally ill when I don't think they are. Secondly, a lot of people are using it. I mean, in Britain, we have 5 million people out of a population of 67 million currently off work. And the vast majority are off work being paid to stay at home because of various mental health related issues, anxiety and so on. And this is completely unprecedented in the history of this country, and is dramatically affecting in a negative way, workplace and people's ability to function as employers. But it's also got a very malevolent side that's now cropped up, where bad people are using mental health as a protective shield against accountability for their crimes. And the classic example in the news this week was Hugh Edwards, who was literally the face of BBC News, the most respected news anchorman in my country. He was the man who announced the Queen's death on the BBC, for example. He was chosen for that honour because he was so respected and so trusted. And he's now been exposed as a paedophile, somebody who was grooming young men, who was paying a paedophile money for illegal images of underage boys. And he's now been sentenced, but he wasn't sent to prison. So you had the juxtaposition of the riots recently in the UK, where people were putting things on Facebook and were being put in prison for 2 years for saying threatening things on Facebook, whereas an active paedophile who was paying another paedophile for illegal images, which involved criminal activity involving the sex abuse of children, did not go to prison. But what was interesting was the way he, through his legal team, tried to mitigate his crimes. And he said a fascinating thing, where he used mental health to lock down any media scrutiny at the time. Media were told to not report this at the time because he was having treatment for mental health. But secondly, he said that his inability to get into Oxford when he was young had meant that when he got to the BBC, he was at a disadvantage, and this had really sort of eaten away at him and damaged him. As if somehow this explained why he then groomed young boys and paid for illegal pictures of children being abused. And all of this whole story showed me the natural pathway of where this was always going to go, which is people weaponizing mental health to protect their own nefarious behavior. And people also using mental health to just be work shy, to not just put a shift in. And both of these things are a really malevolent development.
You're referring to exactly the same phenomena that I was talking about with regards to the pathologization of online behavior. It's the same thing. Pierce, we know as clinicians, at least the honest ones that are left, and that's not very many, we know that the psychopathic manipulators, the cluster B psychopathology types, the dark tetrad types, Machiavellian, narcissistic, psychopathic, and sadistic, a lovely combination. We know that they cloak themselves in moral virtue, and they use pronouncements of self-victimization to manipulate and to conspire. That's what they do, and they're very effective at it. You know, there's a couple of more psychopathic types that I thought about interviewing on my podcast. I won't name any names at the moment, but in the most famous case, I decided against it because I wasn't convinced that he would fail to charm me during the interview. You know, even though I have a fair bit of clinical experience and a pretty decent serpent's eye for the psychopathic types, I'm generally an agreeable person and I give people the benefit of the doubt. I knew Robert Hare a little bit. Robert Hare was the first clinician from the University of British Columbia who really made a pronounced and prolonged study of the psychopathic types. And he interviewed many of the worst criminals, and specifically the psychopathic criminals. So conscienceless might be one way of radically immature, hedonistic, and consciousless. That's how you might describe them. He said that almost invariably they pulled the wool over his eyes and charmed him during the video interviews. And it wasn't until he reviewed the footage later that he could see where their manipulations were. And you have to understand that a well-practiced psychopath who's got 30 years of manipulation under his belt, especially if he's smart, is probably better at pulling the wool over your eyes than you are at detecting him. You know, because your rule of thumb, you're a pretty disagreeable guy, and, you know, you're pretty good at giving people who misbehave a rough time. And so, you know, you might be less prone to that kind of manipulation than the typically more agreeable person, but you don't want to overestimate your capacity to discriminate between the psychopaths and the good guys, especially
I've actually interviewed genuine psychopaths who have been serving lengthy sentences in American prisons, and they've been diagnosed as psychopaths, so kind of devoid of empathy, devoid of sort of normal human emotion, devoid of, you know, one was a young psychopath who killed his sister, who he loved, just to annoy his mother and to distress his mother. And he didn't have any sort of regret. He had no sense of grieving, no sense of empathy about any of it. And it was genuinely fascinating for me to be with this guy for an hour and to try